This is Buckaroo. It was originally designed by Julius Cooper and produced by Ideal in 1970. Today we're going to compare an original edition of the game to the 2004 Milton Bradley edition. Let's see what's changed and what stayed the same over the course of about 35 years. To start, let's have a look at the game boxes. First off, the 1970 box. This is extremely attractive. I love how this looks like the old hand-painted posters for the spaghetti westerns that were common during the era that this was produced. There's no photo of the game itself, but I think actually this depiction is close enough to the model that it doesn't feel at all misleading. I like the blurb on here. Put on a shovel, try a pick. If it's too heavy, the mule will kick. That's lots of fun there. Now, you flip it over, there's nothing really to write home about. It is a two-piece box with ample room for storage, so I'm a big fan of that. This is a neat detail that I thought was great. When you bought this in 1970, it would come packaged with the model of Roo the mule kicking at the tool shed when you unbox this. So this is just great fit and finish for something from 1970, especially a toy like this. I just absolutely love how they did that. So points to Ideal for such a cool package. Another neat thing about this box is this has the original price tag. I thought that was kind of interesting. This sold for $3.79 back in 1970. So if I'm not mistaken, when we adjust for inflation, we're going to be sitting somewhere around, 10, 15 bucks in today's cash. And, that's actually a pretty nice value for a game like this. So pretty cool. Moving on to the 2004 Milton Bradley edition. Look at this box art. This is so bright and colorful, very cheery, very cartoony. The saddle stacking game with a moody mule. Ooh, nice call out there. I like the lettering for Buckaroo. A little bit of blurb with some kids playing the game. When we flip it over, it's that same photo, just larger. A description of the game, a parts list. Now here's something that you'll find interesting in this era is the dual branding of Hasbro and Milton Bradley on the box. Now, Hasbro purchased Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley in the early 90s and eventually brought them into the fold under the name Hasbro Gaming. But in the interim, for a number of years, they continued to publish games under both labels. So this is a prime example here. 2004, they were still producing Buckaroo under the Milton Bradley name, even though it was still branded Hasbro on the box because they were owned by Hasbro. So neat little trivia there. We open this bad boy up. It is a two-piece box with ample room for storage. However, I'll give it, with how much bigger the 2004 model is, this could stand to be a little bit deeper, like a 1/4 inch deeper, would make everything fit just a little bit more evenly. When you put it in here now, little parts of the plastic will press against the lid and back of the box. It feels very uneven. I'm not a fan. So it is enough storage room. I would like just a hair more. Common complaint with modern games. Interesting though, I did like how the bottom lid has art along the edges of the box and it's different on all four sides. Little cowboys and depictions of the mule kicking, Roo kicking. So I thought that was kind of nice. So I do think that the 2004 box is a very acceptable game box. I wish it had a little bit more space as far as how deep the box is, but other than that, nice. Moving on to the gameplay itself. So the 1970 Buckaroo. So how the game is played is players will first set Roo up to buck. That is, hold firmly down at the base, push his head back until he sets. Ooh, it's pretty loud. It's kind of scary, but I mean, it's a spring-loaded mechanism here. I was a little nervous when I first set him up that I was going to break something when I got that loud crack, but that's just how he was built. Now, the first player will place the saddle on Roo's back, and this has a little peg in the center that lines up right here. I think you can see where this is going. So as players begin to add weight to the saddle, eventually the saddle will trigger and Roo will buck all of the gear off. So the player who causes Roo to buck is eliminated from the game. If they manage to stack all 12 pieces on Buckaroo or Roo before he bucks, the player who stacks the last piece wins. Now, if there's more than 2 players, the remaining players who are not eliminated will simply reset Roo and take turns stacking tools on until there's only one left. So again, I get to use one of my favorite gameplay phrases, there can be only one. I love that. I'm gonna do that anytime I get a chance. All right. So the 1970 edition, it's relatively lightweight, though I think it does the job. It's a little scary. You know, he's the ideal 1970 edition is the only one that's all white like this with a red mane, and it kind of scares me a bit. He came on a pale horse and his name was Death. It's a pretty scary looking model, but at the same time, it does the job. There are later versions of this game that were produced by Milton Bradley that used this exact same build, but they changed the color of plastic to brown. And I think stylistically that might have been a better choice, but this is still very eye-catching, very fun. One of the other things I noticed is the gameplay sensitivity. A lot of it is tied to how his hooves slide around on this plate. There's a little bit of a smooth spot on the plate here, and depending on how he lands when you set him, his feet will either kind of hold his back up, or in this instance, they'll be loose and sliding, and the trigger will be a lot more sensitive. I actually think that on this play here, I might only get to stack a couple things. I'm gonna pick the very heaviest stuff. You can see how he's starting to drop his haunches a bit towards the trigger. Oh, we're close. Let's see. Oh, am I gonna get it? Canteen. Oh, I didn't get that. I got two. Oh, and there he goes. So sometimes you can tell it's coming. Other times he stands quite firm, and it's tough to tell when he's gonna go. As you can see, when I'm trying to reset him, you have to be pretty gentle. He can have quite the hair trigger there when you're setting him up. So really cool. I know a lot of people who requested that I have a look at this game pointed out that the old version had a much more sensitive trigger than modern iterations, and I gotta say, it's very unpredictable, which adds to the fun of the gameplay. I also want to point out, when we look at the little pieces here, the detail on these pieces is great. I love the little TNT box. The hat looks really well beat up and actually has kind of a leathery texture on it, which is cool. In this instance, we've got a canteen and horseshoes and a pan, all the regular kind of cowboy gear, and every little bit of it looks just a bit beat up. It has just a little bit of extra detail, and I think that's awesome. It helps add to the overall design of the game. And when you look at the model too, I mean, he's got ribs modeled into him. His hooves are nice. He's shod, so I mean, he's a well taken care of owned mule. But I actually think that quite a bit of love went into the original design here for Buckaroo. So let's have a look at the 2004 playset. Now, the rules are going to be largely the same. However, there are a few changes. Obviously, we can see that, well, this is a much more substantial Buckaroo model, or Roo model. When you lift the saddle blanket, you'll see there's a small switch on his side where you can adjust the sensitivity from 3 to 1. Then what ends up happening is you release the blanket, which is obviously the trigger mechanism. Now, to set the 2004 edition, instead of pushing the head back, you push the tail down until he puts his feet down. The rules are unchanged from 1970. The first player will attach the saddle. Now, I want to point out there are some differences with the saddle here. You know, amongst all the parts from the 1970 edition, the only one that I found was commonly broken when I was trying to recondition this set was the saddle. It can be very difficult. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the saddle for the mid-80s Milton Bradley edition is really, really close. So if you have a 1970 edition and you're looking to find spare parts, look at the early 80s Milton Bradley iterations of the game. And some of the parts are quite interchangeable. The biggest difference is the later iterations, Milton Bradley used the same mold but changed the plastic to brown. You'll see like colored tools. The original 1970 Ideal Edition, contrary to box art, actually only had the red tools. It was a little bit later in their production run that they started introducing different colored plastic. So if you're reconditioning an OG, you're going to want to try to find a red saddle. But these were commonly these little, posts here that you hang all the equipment from are very commonly broken. Now, the newer version for 2004, this is a much bigger, sturdier saddle, but the little spots where you hang the tools, it's very small by comparison, and they've added 2 more along the center. So we have these kind of, I wouldn't call them spikes, but nubs that you hang everything from. Now, he's also got two little holes on the model here where the posts sit in as opposed to one. So it helps you line up front and back when you're setting Roo here. So when we set him up, there we go. We've got him on sensitivity setting 3, which should be the most sensitive. And again, the same rules apply. The first player puts on the saddle, and then remaining players stack on parts. Now, an interesting thing is, because of the adjustable difficulty, I've had varying degrees of luck getting this to be sensitive enough. Like, I'm actually glad that he went off the way that he did during the demonstration, because during playtesting, it was kind of hard to predict if he was going to go off at all. And I would say the first 3 times that I played this on settings 1 through 2, as we were working our way through it, it allowed me to stack all of the parts on Roo quite easily. The only difficulty actually being these little nubs that you're supposed to rest everything on. Now, according to the rules, you don't have to hook everything on the nubs. You simply have to get everything stacked onto his saddle. So that adds a little bit of Jenga to it, because stuff will start falling, or I should say reverse Jenga. Stuff will start kind of falling off and getting uneven. And I think realistically what we're looking at with this is the trigger mechanism is more likely to go off if something starts to slide and the player attempts to catch it. So it's not, I would say it's not quite as touchy as the 1970 edition. At no time during play testing was I able to stack absolutely every tool on the 1970 edition. On the modern edition, on the lower settings like 1 and 2, it was very easy. We had to crank it to 3 to start seeing where the game became more of a challenge. So something to keep in mind here is this Buckaroo is a little bit more bomb-proof by comparison to the moody mule that you might be used to in the past. So that is nice. It's a bit more forgiving for younger players. I like how he's shod with these nice kind of gold yellow shoes here. I like the reset being on the tail as opposed to the head. And I will say, so far, it seems like when you go to reset him using the tail button and everything, he stays set. With the older Roo, it was a little bit more of a challenge, as you saw earlier, setting his head back. You had to kind of treat it like it was almost like setting a landmine or something. You just sort of back away slowly. Okay, it's time to begin. As far as the modeling, we've added a little froggy friend here for Roo, and you know, I'm going to set him off so I can... One thing that I'm not a big fan of is when you lock his feet. So for storage, he comes off of this platform. You're supposed to push his feet into these slots, push down, and pull back to lock. There's a little bit of a barbed section there to the plastic that holds him to the base, and he kicks forward so much that it hardly holds him on. But I don't really think that that harms the gameplay. This will give us access to the base, though, to have a look. The base on the 70 edition is just textured like dirt with a little smooth patch where his hooves hit. This has a little bit more modeling. We've got tin can, footprints, an old loose shoe, a frog. He's really living in kind of a junkyard when I look at how much litter is just underfoot. I would hate to have to call a farrier over him standing on one of these broken cans and getting a piece of metal in there. So poor Roo in the modern Buckaroo, he lives in a junkyard next to a swamp, because I mean there's water here, there's a frog. Just very interesting choice of landscape is all I'm saying, and maybe I'm missing the forest for the trees. The actual model itself is very colorful. They have concealed the mechanism, so compared to the 1970 edition, where the mechanism is actually visible and accessible from underneath, this is all put together with Phillips head screwdrivers. It's a lot more chunky. I will say, if you're going to have kids playing it, that's a nice safety measure. You're not going to have little kids sticking their fingers up in the works and getting hurt or pinched in one of these springs, because the spring on the older edition is no joke. It's a pretty solid steel spring, as I'm sure the spring in this has to be in order to kick over such a heavy model. And that brings me to why I've chosen to look at the 2004 edition of Buckaroo as opposed to the current edition as produced by Hasbro. This is a very particular model because this was the edition that got pulled off the market. In 2006, a child was playing with this edition of Buckaroo and took an eye injury. The subsequent lawsuit forced Milton Bradley / Hasbro to pull this game in 2006, and it was later reintroduced in 2008, unchanged save for some new addendums in the rules to encourage people to stay a little bit further back so that they don't get hit with flying parts. But the media firestorm basically caused the game to be unavailable for about 2 years. Now, when the game was introduced, like I said, they used the exact same mold, the exact same mechanism. The current packaging is updated with Hasbro branding, and the cartoon is a little bit different, but largely the same. I thought it was kind of interesting to bring this one in, one, because it's exactly the same physically, and two, it was kind of unique when you're choosing between the two as to which one caused the injury. I wanted to see if perhaps this one had a particularly strong spring mechanism, or if there was anything in particular to write home about as to why this would have been considered the dangerous model. But as you can see, over the years, as the game had been redesigned, I actually think that it got safer and safer and safer. At this instance, even we're talking the tools that you stack on Roo, they're a little less detailed, but they're all much more well-rounded. Not that there's really any sharp edges on the 1970 edition, but I will say these were two-part molds, and so sometimes you get a little sharp edge on the seam where the mold comes apart, so like the edge of the shovel's a little bit sharp. You compare that to the modern shovel, you can hardly tell where the mold came apart. They kind of got that tolerance down there. There were some subtle differences also in the tools, like for instance, the original 1970 edition has a TNT crate. The 2004 and the current edition now just change it out for an unmarked crate. However, I thought, well, are they eliminating the dynamite? Well, no, they added a TNT bundle of 3 sticks of TNT. So kind of strange choice there. They also eliminated the horseshoes and they added a lantern. I think we also got a bedroll. They eliminated the boot and the pick, and for some reason the modern version has this piece. This is a gun belt and gun, but this has to be the lightest piece of all the tools. So I don't know if they added it in there as kind of like for a player who wants to cheese it and go, I'm going for the absolute lightest, but thematically it doesn't seem to fit, and it's such a almost useless tool. I wish they would have added something else of closer weight to the other pieces to the playset, because the sensitivity on this model of Buckaroo is such that, especially if you have it on the lower settings, you really need that weight to set that off. Boy, that does kind of drive me nuts how he comes right out of that base there. But anyway, I think actually the gameplay between both of them being the same, the biggest thing boils down to safety and availability. If I were somebody looking for the nostalgia of the 1970 edition, you know, there's nothing wrong with these. They're very stable, they're very well put together. They can just be hard to track down in good condition. And I can understand why playing something like this, you would kind of feel like, you know, they don't make them like they used to. So kind of an interesting look there. I do want to point out, at this point in the show, I'm normally going to be looking at rule books. Unfortunately, this 2004 edition, though it does note on the box it should come with a rule set, did not have a rule set when I acquired it, and the rules are printed on the inside of the Buckaroo case. So I'm going to give all the points for that section straight up to the Buckaroo case for having a set of rules that cannot be lost so long as you keep everything together in the box. I'm going to assume that what we had in this is pretty standard fare for the era, so most likely a full color print on sealed paper, which those do tend to stand the test of time, but as proven right here, they can get lost easier when the instructions are printed separate. So win to the 1970. I'm going to go ahead and say that I actually think both editions are a lot of fun. I did have more fun with the vintage version, I'm not going to lie. I don't feel like the vintage version is the legendary status that a lot of my viewers like to put it at. I had a lot of people talking about how, boy, this sucker is gonna launch game pieces across the room. It's gonna make you jump 3 feet off the table. You're gonna lose your mind when you play this original version. It's so dangerous. And actually playing it, I mean, it doesn't matter which version you're playing. If you're not expecting Roo to jump, or even if you are, like, even if you're just sitting here like me, haphazardly stacking them on, expecting them to jump, The trigger on this is fantastic. When he goes, and it's so lightweight that the clatter that it makes when all the parts fall, that really gets a rise out of you. So, I mean, I gotta say that this game probably plays just as well as it ever did, probably just as good as the day it came out of the box, save for the wear and tear. I'm also gonna go ahead and say that clearly this 2004 edition has held up beautifully. It's gorgeous art. The sculpt is amazing. I'm not going to take anything away from the artists on this one. I think this redesign, this modern design of Buckaroo, given their target audience, given the change in technology that we've had between 1970 and the 2004 era when this was made, they made all the right moves. I do understand where when you read reviews for the late model Buckaroos, people say, oh man, this is, you know, not sensitive enough. It hardly ever goes off. We're always able to stack everything on. I'm going to go ahead and say that even on level 3, if you're really concentrating and you're really trying, it is possible to get every tool stacked on this. And I know how some people who are real try hard on this might be disappointed by that. To be fair, the target market for a game like this is actually quite young. And I do think that they attempted to account for the lack of sensitivity with the saddle design. Oh, it's kind of odd. With the saddle design, in that having these pegs be much smaller when you're hanging things on, it becomes more of a game of actually trying to get it to stay on and actually trying to block other players from having spots to hang things on. And as you can see, I'm setting this game off just fine playing it in front of you, because a lot of it has to do more with how awkward it is to stack things on as opposed to just the weight of the 1970 edition. So that's important to keep in mind. Given the target audience, given who's playing it, I'm not disappointed by this edition of Buckaroo, and I don't think that many people would be. However, that being said, if it's an older audience, hey, guess what? Skill issue. You are simply going to have steadier hands than younger players, and this won't feel nearly as challenging. So this is much more of kind of a roulette, where based on the cumulative weight of all of the different tools, and some way more than others, it becomes a little bit more of a strategy game. This, it's not just weight, it has to do with space on the saddle, and a lot to do with just making people jump as things slip off and hitting it. So I think the designers had the right idea in trying to come up with a way to both make the game easy enough that a kid could win it if they tried hard enough, while at the same time requiring a certain amount of skill from older players. So it's, you know, not the greatest iteration as far as sensitivity and making you jump. Is it a fun game? Absolutely. Is the art great? Oh, yeah. He looks just like the front of the box. This is wonderful. Like if I was giving the gift to a kid, 100%, I would go with one of the newer versions of Buckaroo. So Buckaroo, hey, we've seen the breakdown, you've seen the tools, you've seen the game. What do you think about it? Do you prefer the original model, or do you think the new update has a lot to offer? Comment below and let me know.